I work on Midway Island. Yes, that same Midway from the battle that you might have read about in your World War II history class. Back in the day, this island used to house a massive naval base with hundreds of sailors and dozens of ships and planes. But after the war, the base was shut down, and the island was all but forgotten. It's not abandoned, not by any means. There's around 40 of us who live here on the island now. There are a few medics, a few dozen workers who make sure the island's airstrip stays in working order, and 500 researchers who study birds. None of us live here permanently, though. It's too small and too loud with all the birds. Oh, the birds. Midway is an important breeding ground for several species of migrating seabird. Go ahead, go to Google Maps and drop a street view anywhere on the island. Every square foot of it has its own bird. Here's a few examples for you if you don't know what I mean. Every day and night, their calls never stop. I was lucky. Pretty soon my brain managed to file bird call under the white noise category. If someone didn't point them out, I wouldn't have noticed them. My co-worker Bill was different though. Bill hated the birds. Every single day when we changed shifts into the small radio room on the island, he had a new complaint. They'd nested inside his window. They'd eaten his plants. They'd crapped all over his bike. I told him that it just came with the job, but he always would grunt and continue complaining anyway. Nothing I ever said made any impact on his sour mood. Then, one day, I found him with a slingshot in a pile of bird carcasses surrounding the concrete World War II area radio room where we both worked. He looked embarrassed that I'd found him like that and tried hiding the slingshot in a drawer. I did my best to act as if I hadn't seen it, but we both knew that I had. He left me at my post in an awkward, bumbling hurry. The birds were extra loud that afternoon. Like I said, I was normally pretty good at zoning them out, but it almost seemed like they were upset. My shift ended a little after 10 p.m. I stepped outside to look up at the stars. Some people say you need to drive up into the mountains to get a good view of the stars. Some people say you'll get a better view in a desert. But I knew the truth. The best view of stars anyone could ever get was on a deserted island. The nearest contact was on Honolulu, and that was nearly 5 hours away by plane. The Milky Way cut a swath of light across the sky, dividing it in two. It was starkly, hauntingly beautiful, but it also reminded me of just how far we were from any help. I did my best to keep the worry out of my mind, and tried just to appreciate the wonder of life as I made the rest of my way down the small dorm room. When I arrived, I quickly fell asleep. The next morning, I awoke to the sounds of tens of thousands of birds flying around. I stepped outside and stared up at the swirling cloud of seabirds. They looked like locusts, nearly blotting out the sun with their numbers. Something about it almost seemed biblical. This was my first year on the island, though, so I figured this was just a part of their migration breeding process. I was scheduled to relieve Bill around noon at the Radio Shack. I walked across the island while listening to music. I'd just found a new podcast that I'd really been enjoying. I reached the radio door room and found it was hanging open. I pushed it, stepped inside. Bill sat in a chair just inside. His eye sockets were little more than bloody holes. Feathers coated the ground, though there were no birds inside that I could see. Long gouges of flesh were missing from his face, arms, and particularly his neck. Blood stained his clothes. I backed up, my hand raising to my mouth. Then I turned around and looked across the island at the tens of thousands of nesting birds. The birds were staring directly at me. They weren't moving or calling or flying. They just stared. I slowly backed into the radio room and slammed the door shut. I don't know how much good a wooden door would do me, but I locked it shut anyway. I called then for emergency evacuation by the radio, and they told me they would be arriving later tonight. I'm still waiting in the radio room. I don't know how a plane will safely land with all those birds flying around. But I know I'll have to leave and walk through them to get to the airstrip when it finally lands. My grandfather, aged 98, served in the British military from 1940 to 1948. He has several medals in his time from service. It also goes without saying he has quite a few stories to tell. He has stories of being a POW to the Germans, storming forts, and, according to him, disemboweling a man with a garden trowel. Even in his old age, he still can recollect them clearly. His most interesting story, however, is from December of 1944. He had escaped a German POW camp where he was placed in while they prepared a transferal to a concentration camp. It was during his time on the run he came to a small German town. The people, who were no fans of Adolf, hid him from the Gestapo. However, there would be no need. The following is the story, as written in his journal.
I believe the date was December 5th or 6th. The people hid me from Hitler's men, but seemed fearful to walk the street on this night. The children were excited for the coming of St. Nicholas, I gathered. Hitler had tried to scrub away any religious influence on the holiday, but in small villages such as this, the people did not adhere to all the Führer's guidelines. I was hidden away with a family of 4, 2 children, a mother and her father. The father of the children was conscripted to Hitler's army, the Wehrmacht. The children were about 9 or 10, if I had to guess. I didn't see them that much, as I was beneath the floor, with a small window as my only company on that moonlit night as it shone through the glass. I heard the mother speak with who I can only presume was the SS looking for me. They barked something in German, and then the air went silent. I heard one of the lesser Nazis say, and this is a rough translation as I don't know much of the German, "Commander, we must be going." His voice seemed almost frightened. I heard sleigh bells at that moment, and noticed the Nazi voices get even more panicked in tone. The door shut then, and the children were placed in the cellar. I assumed that I was in the cellar, with me. I looked across the road, out of the only window in the place, and saw a silhouette in the night. The figure appeared to wear a cloak and a set of goat horns. This would be strange enough, but it was also on top of a home. I heard screaming from above me, the scream of the mother and the Nazis. There was a crash, and I felt a chill in the air. I silenced the children as best I could, who at this point were understandably frightened. There were gunshots, then more silence. I expected to hear the barking of the Gestapo, but instead I heard heavy steps, like hooves, but far too large. Chains seemed to be scraping the floor above the children and I. The door to the hidden area swung open at that moment. The son, I believe his name was Klaus, let out a shriek, and suddenly was snatched up, through the floorboards. Same with the little girl. I wasn't going to sit by and let this happen. I rose from my hiding place, shaken but undeterred. The bodies of the mother and the Gestapo and her father lay gutted and strewn about. The gore on the being's horns named it the culprit. It was putting the daughter in the large sack on its back, where I could see movement from what I could only assume was other children. It wore many furs and chains. It had a hunched disposition. I yelled at the cloaked figure. It turned, standing upright from its hunched position. It stood easily 9 or so feet tall. It had the body of a man, with large, sharp, knife-like fingers. The horns were a part of its person, growing from its goat-like head. It smiled at me with crooked, rotten teeth. Its eyes were also very much goat-like. Among its many chains were sleigh bells jingling as it moved, the source of the bells earlier. I moved to grab the pistol from the dead Gestapo's hand and fired it. The creature didn't move. It hardly seemed phased. It let out a cackle and left the home. Why had it not killed me? I ran after it and saw many other homes in the village were similarly ransacked. Bodies were strewn about, and their fireplaces were seemingly demolished. It threw its large bag onto the sleigh, pulled by 9 hellish goats. The sleigh itself was adorned with many furs and additional chains. Human faces in anguish were also visible, though I can't be sure if they were actual faces or merely representations. I heard the cries of the children, and it gave me one more grin. It said to me simply, "Fröhliche Krampusnacht." It whipped the goats, and they ran off into the night. That night I would hear many screams in the distance. I noticed the children remaining in the village 2 mornings later were greeted with a great deal of gifts. I left after 2 days and continued to Allied territories, ducking Gestapo at every turn.
Ever since I was a kid, he insisted that all his grandchildren and children stay at his home on December 5th. And he always made sure the fire burned hot. My Grandpa's Stories from World War II by Harry Down 2. My grandpa has a lot of stories about his time in the war. Amid the general chaos and inhumanity of battle, some inexplicable things happened. Here they are in his words. We were holed up in a trench, starving and freezing. We couldn't turn around because the Germans were also hiding a ways back, as well as in front of us. After a few days, the 5 of us, that was all that was left of my squadron at the time, decided we either moved or died where we sat. We all agreed to go left and hoped we'd get out of the sights of the enemy. We crawled for a very long time. I'm not sure how much land we covered, and eventually we succeeded in escaping the area. We then came across a bunker an hour or so later and approached with as much caution as we could muster, but fortunately for us it was abandoned. We camped inside and found, to our surprise, a ration box. Looked like an ammo box, but it was filled with food stuff instead. We dug in, and not until we devoured about half of it did we realize that one of our riflemen told us to read the labels. Some of them were in French, some few in English. They were brands we hadn't heard of, and all of them had manufacturing dates that were decades in the future. A biscuit box I ate had, packaged August 1988. We didn't dwell on that, but it was unnerving. I kept a few packets. They're around here somewhere. A few weeks later, my squad was merged into a company headed for the south of France as a backup for a tank convoy. We were commanded to search buildings on either side for the enemy. I hated that job. Every corner promised death. My partner Michael and I took turns clearing rooms. On one he turned and he froze up. I thought there were enemies and got into position. But when he turned around, his face was ghostly white, and I knew it was something else, so I took a look of my own. I saw a small room absolutely covered in human remains and blood. I mean dripping in them, ceiling and all, like a grenade or maybe 20 grenades had gone off. Except there was no charring whatsoever, no burnt smell, and the furniture wasn't even damaged. There were no bullet holes or casings, no weapons or anything. It was a bunch of people, SS by the uniform scraps, but there looked to be dress scraps in there too, had been torn to smithereens. Most of our squadron got a look in that room, but no one could explain just what on earth had gone down in there. Something many thousands of soldiers experienced on all sides was Our Lady. That's the nickname we gave her anyway. A kind of singing, ethereal wailing could be heard occasionally, usually mid-afternoon or night. Perhaps it was some kind of experimental horn or siren, but whatever it was haunting. Haunting and beautiful. Then there was the story of the extra members circulating through the ranks. An advisory trickled down to us privates that soldiers could take count of their members randomly, and most often than usual, especially if they were having a streak of bad luck. It was a bit vague, until the first-hand accounts got around that many different squads and platoons had been finding an extra among them, who nobody knew the name of and who wouldn't speak. Some men said they'd let him to run away. Others claimed to have shot him dead when discovered, only to have the same guy show up again a few days later. They all described him more or less the same. Brown hair, hazel eyes, olive skin. This guy was bad luck personified, in my opinion. Apparently, the longer he was with you unnoticed, the more freak accidents men in your platoon experienced. Thank God I never saw him myself. I did see Missy, a ginger tabby missing half an ear with a black stripe between her eyes. Skittish damn thing as hell close up, wouldn't let you touch her, but cool as a cucumber from a distance. I met her in my first week at war, gave her some of my sea ration. Then again, about 50 miles away. Then again, and again, and again in many locations, sometimes right in the heat of a battle. All up, I saw her in over a dozen places miles apart, and what was more, I wasn't the only one either. She was known by a lot of pet names among the others, but I personally cared for Missy the most. I didn't see her again after the war, hardly even thought of her until my other great-grandson, a soldier himself, recently told me a story that brought it all back. See, I'd assumed she'd been killed by something, stray bullet, old age, and if not, she was definitely long dead by now, as nature would have it. But then David told me of a cat he and his friend had spotted several times on tour in Iraq, defying death left and right, and always watching someone. He described Missy to a T. He had nicknamed her Lucky. I'd never told any of my family about Missy or about that particular story before then. Maybe it was a different cat, but I don't think it was. There you have it. He knows how improbable these all may sound, but he swears by every one. We have a saying here in the Austrian mountains. Wann's wirklich hin is, krammt's nimmer ham, tuat's doch, holt der Teufel sein Schulden. Which roughly translated means, if something is dead, it will never come home again. If it does, it might just be the devil coming to get even. My grandpa always closed his World War II stories with this little poem. As a child, I didn't think of it much, as I was more into the whole war aspect of his tales. He was a tank commander in the German army before the Nazis took over. I was always afraid that my grandpa was a Nazi, but he assured me that as soon as he had the chance, he ran off and left the Wehrmacht. When the war started, he got assigned to a little post in the mountain region of Slovenia on the Austrian border side. His tank and 3 others should watch and protect the outpost against Slovenian freedom fighters. Grandpa tried to befriend the resistance, however, so they could get him out of the Nazi army. Months went by. The deepest and coldest winter came up, and Grandpa soon learned about the Austrian mythology of Krampus. I'm almost certain some of you have heard of that, mostly because of the movie or the interview with the Austrian actor Christoph Waltz. So I'm not going to get all too deep into this lore. Just imagine a bunch of German soldiers somewhere far from home on some dark and lost mountain, unable to go back home and unable to push forward, as they have the enemy on both sides, freezing through the coldest of nights just to witness a Krampus walk. Around 50 to 60 villagers, all dressed as the devil himself, walking through the deep woods with a bunch of torches. No talking, no yelling, just the noise of hundreds of chains which they wore around their necks. Grandpa always changed when he talked about the Krampus walk and how his men felt at this moment. Heavily armed soldiers sitting on some of the most massive tanks at the time, and they were all scared to their bones. One night, around that time, the Krampuslauf came to a halt. They surrounded the soldiers' camp while almost everyone was asleep, except for my grandpa. He took the chance, stepped in front of them, threw away his weapon, and tried to talk to them. To be honest, I was too young to remember what happened and how they finally ended up helping him get down from this godforsaken mountain and out of the Nazi army. But it was a few months later that he met my grandma, so surviving all of this brought him closer to heaven and redemption. All of this is also not the point of why I'm writing this subreddit. The point is, I'm not sure if he found heaven or redemption, because I'm afraid my grandpa did a pact with the devil. 2 weeks ago, he passed away, so I got to pick up some of his stuff and clean up the house. Grandpa lived a quiet life after my grandma died years before him, so all that was left was his bed, his books, and of course his rocking chair, in which he used to sit and tell me his war stories. I thought about keeping the rocking chair, and had dreamed about telling my grandkids my own stories one day in it. But after what I had witnessed just about 10 minutes ago, I am honestly willing to set it and the house on fire. If something is dead, it will never come home again. If it does, it might just be the devil coming to get even. These words, spoken by the rusty voice of my grandpa, flew through my head as I opened the living room door and saw the rocking chair slowly rocking back and forth. Moaning and screeching with every little move, the voice in my head got louder and louder, almost screaming at me. It might just be the devil. Had my grandpa done a deal with the devil to get off the mountain? Was all of this true? Has any one of you guys heard about something like this before? What am I supposed to do? As I am writing this, the chair kept rocking, and the voice in my head won't stop. I need help, please.